Okay, well, thank you for joining us for this evening's event. My name is Bill Leggett, and I'm a bookseller at Powell's Books. Before we begin, I wanted to encourage you to check out our lineup of upcoming virtual events by visiting our website at powells.com. One of the many great events we're looking forward to is Steve Olson in conversation with Tom Carpenter, which takes place Monday, August 3rd. They'll talk about Olson's new book, The Apocalypse Factory, Plutonium and the Making of the Atomic Age. Please consider following us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. As well, if you haven't already done so, please sign up for our weekly events email at powells.com. And now on to tonight's event. And we are honored to welcome Kate Greene in conversation with Dr. Sian Proctor. Kate Greene is a former laser physicist, a poet, and an essayist whose work has appeared in Wired, The Economist, The Atlantic, and The New Yorker, among other publications. And she's taught writing at Vanderbilt University, San Francisco State University, and the Tennessee Prison for Women. She currently is a teaching fellow in the writing department at Columbia University. Kate's book, Once Upon a Time, I Lived on Mars, Space, Exploration, and Life on Earth, is an essay collection inspired by the author's 4-month stay, along with 5 fellow crew members, in NASA's first high seas mission, a simulated Martian environment located in Hawaii. In these essays, Kate draws on this experience to contemplate humanity's impulse to explore, adapt, and communicate, both inside the secluded environment and in the world we all share. And Kate is joined in conversation tonight by Dr. Sian Proctor, who is a geology, sustainability, and planetary science professor at South Mountain Community College, Phoenix, Arizona. Examples of Sian's passion for space exploration and sustainable food practices include her TEDx talk titled Eat Like a Martian, and her Meals for Mars website and cookbook. Not coincidentally, Dr. Proctor was also a member of NASA's first high seas mission. This evening's event will also include a Q&A. Please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen if you'd like to ask a question. As well, if someone has typed a question that you'd like to know the answer to, please consider upvoting that particular question by clicking the thumbs up button. And most importantly, please consider supporting Kate Greene and Powell's by purchasing a copy of the book, Once Upon a Time I Lived on Mars. A link to buy the book will be shared in the chat this evening. Kate, Sian, it's an honor to welcome you both today. Thanks for joining us and have a great event.
Thank you, Bill.
You're welcome.
Thank you for having us. And so, Kate, I just want to say how much I love this book. It was the first time I've read a book where I actually lived some of the experiences. And so I'm so excited to talk to you about what themes emerged from this book for me and how your life has changed, because it's been, well, we went in 2013. So it's been 7 years since we were in the high seas habitat. And so, yeah. I know, weird, huh? Just a different world.
Yeah, totally different world.
My first question for you is about transformations. And because one of the things that I love is you once told me that you went into the high seas habitat as a science writer and you left a poet. And so when I think about transformations and, well, becoming Kate, when I read this, there was so much about you transforming in this, through this experience. So how has the high seas experience and writing this book changed your life, changed who you are?
Oh yeah, okay. Well, you started with the big one, so I'll see what I can say to that. Well, high seas was a very formative experience for me. It was such a strange thing to do, to have NASA give you permission as an adult to pretend to live on Mars. I mean, not being an astronaut, just being like someone with a science background, being a science journalist, and being selected to do this mission, it felt very special and also very strange, because it was just like it's an experience unlike any other. So to live in that dome right behind you for 4 months, to not be changed in some way, I think that would be a pretty strange thing. And I used that time as like a scientist writer. I conducted a sleep study and took data, and also as a writer, I brought a ton of books, not a ton, that would be too heavy. I brought a box of books that didn't weigh a ton, and I read them and I wrote a lot. And so, and I was writing from, going in, I went in as someone who writes about science from the outside looking in, but this time I was like inside the experiment writing out. So it really changed my relationship to the way that I write, for sure. But then, that ended in August of 2013, and this book is out now in 2020, a completely different world. So like there's 7 years in between. And I was really trying to figure out what it was that I wanted to write about that experience. Day to day, there wasn't like much to say. There wasn't necessarily a narrative arc. So I realized though that I kept thinking again and again about themes. And so that's kind of how the essay collection coalesced. I thought about the themes of food and home and isolation and communication and boredom and bodies, and how astronaut bodies are a real problem in space, those sort of like, because they're not easily engineered systems, and yet they have to fit into an engineered system. So anyway, I just started thinking about all these themes. And as I was writing the book, paying attention to what was going on in my life, it all just sort of got wrapped up in there. And, that's what came up in this book.
When you talk about that, it makes me wonder, because it's 7 years later and we've grown and changed, and the world we're in now just doesn't feel as familiar as the one we had in 2013. And so 2 questions I have for you. One is, did you ever want to go to space camp when you were a kid? And the second one is, if the opportunity, if you hadn't gone on in then, and who you are now, would you still, is this an opportunity that you would have seeked out now if it was just happening?
Oh, interesting. Well, yeah, of course, space camp is good. I wanted to. It just wasn't possible. I remember we all in the Habitat had that conversation, didn't we? Like, who went to space camp? Turned out none of us did. So it was almost like we're all like scratching an itch in some way to like be like our own personal space camp. And yeah, I don't know who I am now. It's tricky because, I have done this thing and I feel like in some ways pretty satisfied playing this role in NASA's history of space exploration. It feels good to me to know that like over these 4 months, I donated that data and, it's being used now, and eventually it will be made public. Everyone who wants to can ask different questions about, that data, slice it and dice it in different ways, and just figure out what it would take to like help people survive a mission to Mars, which is actually really challenging physically, psychologically, sociologically. It's a tough thing. So I feel okay about my role in that. And I mean, to go to space now, yeah, of course. Like if someone were to say, hey, here's a 2-week ticket and you can circle the moon, land on the moon. Yeah, I mean, yeah. But like, I think honestly, Mars seems like not a thing that I'm super into right now. I think about Earth and I think about how great Earth is, and I really do like Earth. But I think the moon would be a fun trip, and the ISS is fine, but like you're up there for a long time and it's kind of like the same, No offense. It's very exciting to be on the International Space Station.
I am the same way. And it's kind of ironic because they launched Perseverance today and it was a successful launch, but going to the red planet is, I came out of high seas with a fundamental appreciation, more of an appreciation for the Earth than I even had before.
Yeah.
Going to the moon, sure, a couple weeks, circle it, yeah. But the Earth is my favorite place too.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I remember you saying in particular, you would have loved to do a shuttle mission because it just seemed like the ideal length of time. You're up there for like 10 days, like 10 to 17 days or whatever those lengths were. And then you got to see the curve of the Earth, and then you got to come back. So, and of course a moon mission, but yeah, it's interesting that you had that experience too. I mean, 4 months in isolation is kind of, it was enough for me, gotta say. And it was certainly enough to make me appreciate what we have on this planet.
And that's a perfect segue into the next thing that I want to talk to you about, which is boredom. And I want to take a moment and have you read from page 48.
All right. Okay. So this is the end of the boredom essay.
It is.
So are you thinking?
I discovered that certain behaviors.
Yeah. All right. I discovered that certain behaviors, imagining oneself in the future, making new plans, learning new skills, setting goals, trying to refresh and start anew, are typical of someone who feels bored. I could check off all of these. For as long as I can remember, I've responded to an ill-defined itch inside that propels me to constantly dream of other ways of being. I was often inspired to try new things on Mars, like writing projects, drawing, or finally learning the ukulele. And there was absolutely a point in the mission when all I could do was think about future plans, signing up for a timeshare yurt with friends, for instance, or traveling to Puerto Rico or Japan or writing a book. Some of these imaginings certainly bordered on bliss. All this felt familiar somehow. Might I actually suffer from chronic boredom and not even know it? If only boredom could be compartmentalized. I do wonder how much of this has to do with the interest in sending people to Mars, as if astronauts and explorers might act as bearers of a culture's collective boredom. In their exploration of new worlds, might they also carry with them a larger, shared yearning for the possible?
I could completely resonate with what you said here about dreaming. I'm a futurist. I'm always thinking about what's going to come down the pipeline versus being in the moment. And I wonder how writing this book and talking and really diving deep into boredom and idleness, how has that changed you? And do you feel like you're still, got itchy feet?
Yeah, I mean, just short answer, yeah. And especially now, because we're all kind of, we're it's hard to think of a future. For some of us, the future is really hard to imagine right now. For others, it's all you can imagine. And so, yeah, the time on high seas really illuminated something for me, because I did think that I was a person who didn't get bored, but I think it's actually the opposite. I think that I'm like always bored and always looking for new things, and so, and I can generally find them kind of in any situation. But in writing the book, it's interesting that you talk about like future thinking, because I think this book was a chance for me to sit with a lot of things that happened in the past and were happening in the present. So like there's a lot of, present thinking in the book that I didn't quite expect. And it's not so much a prognostication for the future, but, asking questions about what would it be like? And maybe why are we doing all of this anyway? So the book was an experiment and sort of like more looking back and then like sitting with the feelings I was having as I wrote the book, which is certainly an idle process. I mean, to write a book, you're sitting still. And so that's an experience in itself.
And thinking about the things that you brought in to try to combat the possibility of boredom. And I remember the ukulele and
Yeah.
you reading a lot and writing a lot, but also kind of trying to be proactive, like how can I deal with this in a proactive way? And I think now, if you were to go on an expedition like to Antarctica or someplace that again you were going to experience a long duration of time in an extreme isolated environment, having this experience, are there things fundamentally that you would change about how you would deal with boredom, or do you think that it's who you are and then adapting within that situation into that? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I like what you just said. I mean, I think it's probably more of the latter, because in a way, I could bring all the like small like entertainments with me and try to keep myself busy, but in the end I think that it's just kind of who I am, and I always will have to find a way. I think that being social is really important to me, and so like figuring out new and good ways to be social with people I think would be a really important aspect of it. I think that I look back on our time in the dome, and I know that so many of those conversations were so crucial to me and like my well-being, and I really appreciated so many of those. And also just like corresponding with people over email, because we had that communication delay, so we didn't have any real-time communication, and that worked really well for the isolation effect. And so for me, it's a lot of it's wrapped up in communication. Having good conversation partners, I think, is really important to me.
And what's funny about that is that I'm learning to accept that I'm novelty driven, that I'm also like, oh, new thing, running off and teaching. And then I get, bored. And I'm like, okay, I need another new thing. And I'm a starter. And, but what you just triggered something, a memory for me, was the crew and the fact that we had 3 extroverts and 3 introverts, and need for conversations, good conversations, and how some people needed that and others didn't. Had you been in a crew where you didn't have Angelo and Jahira, would you have gone nuts?
It would have been different. It's very possible that I would have, or I might have just found a different way, who's to say at this point? But it is interesting, I like to think about the fact that NASA, this problem of astronaut boredom is a really difficult thing for NASA to study, because astronauts are loath to admit that they're ever bored in space, because you're bored, then we're not going to send you back, so like these are questions that are really important to ask of people who are participating in these like extended isolation experiments, because it's our job to talk about how we feel, and to like be honest about the fact that there was a sameness that wore me down day in and day out, that was pretty hard. So I think that's like one of the interesting parts of these sorts of experiments, is you can get at things that astronauts won't talk about necessarily.
I totally agree. And thinking about combinations of personalities and bringing them together in interesting ways right off the bat. And so without those years of training and really getting to know each other's ticks, because another part of that, because you're a writer, you're very observant. And that was part of the thing that you were particularly keen on in the high seas habitat, is watching and observing. And then over time, certain things, you noticed patterns where you're like, that's kind of annoying.
Yeah. And I mean, that was an issue for me as a writer, but I gotta say, like today, for so many people who have been in close quarters with their families, or whoever they're living with, I think that this is a problem that's well documented in space literature and exploration literature. The fact that micro annoyances grow macro over time, it's just a fact. You can't get around it. And so you really have to understand that when you're feeling that annoyance, that's a normal feeling, and it's on you to sort of like deep breath, let it go. And I did that to more or less a degree during the mission, I guess. You were pretty good at that. You let things go, right?
I do. I do let things go, but what I loved about in the book is that you bring in, you masterfully weave in stories from other astronauts and experiences and literature and all of these things. And Commander Kelly, and the fact that there was a person that was just kind of like getting on his nerves, and the fact that he had to take a muscle relaxer, and the chemicals just made his brain say, this is okay. and it's like, maybe we all need a little pill to help us get through if we go to Mars, some of those tics and things. Like, could medicine help us be better when it comes to long duration space flight to some extent?
Exactly. Why the taboo? Like, this is a thing that he took for his body, but also positively affected his mind, his mood, his mental state. And isn't that also part of the mission? And so the idea of pharmaceuticals being like a taboo response to a problem that's very normal. I think that there's just a sense that astronauts aren't normal, that they're special, that they're like better than humans, so they don't have to be tended to in that way. And so I think that yeah, I don't know. Just again, it's really nice to know that we played a role in talking about how these things are actually pretty hard and might be useful to think about and ask more questions about for a mission to Mars.
Oh, I totally agree. And especially when we're looking at COVID and self-isolation and the strains that it puts on people around the world. And you know, I kind of feel like we're all living as analog astronauts right now. And so lots of information that we can gain from this time. I want to talk about the psychology of the spacesuit, because here we are living in, you know, a Mars on Earth, but for us as a crew, the spacesuit was extremely important because we wanted to feel from a psychological standpoint that we were, you know, on Mars. And I know that spacesuits have always been an issue in NASA and space exploration, especially when it comes to gender and sizes. We face the same thing on high seas. And so I want to take a moment and have you read on page 99 about spacesuits and NASA.
Sure. Okay, yeah, awesome. 99 is an interesting page too, because when the book came out, I got an email from a blogger who collects people's authors' responses to the question, what's on page 99, and does it truly represent your book? Because there's a writer, Ford Maddox Ford, who I think said something to the effect of, your book is what it's going to be by page 99. And, you know, that's not always the case, but when I got this email, I was like, well, let's see what's on page 99. And at the very top of page 99, it is made by Playtex, the women's bra manufacturer. And so I was just like, yes, absolutely. This is exactly what the book is. So, okay, this section, maybe I should just say that we had these neon green XXL hazmat suits that Kim Binstead, the principal investigator of High Seas, purchased from a government surplus website, and they were pretty ugly. We thought they needed a lot of work to make them even functional, because they were so large and cumbersome, which is actually very spacesuit-like, because spacesuits are not comfortable. It's not like, you know, you're not riding a bike in a spacesuit. So yeah. So that's kind of like the setup, but maybe I'll start with a little bit of background on spacesuits. Oh yeah, exactly. That's what they look like. So in 1994, Neil Armstrong sent NASA a thank you letter for his spacesuit. It turned out to be the most widely photographed spacecraft in history, he wrote. That was no doubt due to the fact that it was so photogenic. Though its true beauty, Armstrong added, was that it worked. Prodigious layers of choice material, cleverly assembled, is all that separates astronauts on EVAs from a harsh death by void. Spacesuit as spacecraft, then. A house not much bigger than a body, to paraphrase the poet Francis Ponge, who was writing more generally about monuments and their scale. A spacesuit can be seen as a shell of a person's own size that employs humanity's genius for adaptation and not disproportion. Armstrong's human-sized spaceship was designed and made by Playtex, the women's bra manufacturer. It's a riveting underdog story told in Nicholas de Monchaux's book, Spacesuit, Fashioning Apollo. The Playtex team, led by a car mechanic and former television repairman, had made up of seamstresses and engineers, convinced NASA to let them send in a test suit for consideration, competing at their own expense against two other companies NASA had invited to the bid. With its 21 layers of neoprene rubber, metallized polyester films, and other materials, the Playtex suit outperformed the competition, proving it could protect astronauts from the dramatic temperature shifts in space from 240 degrees Fahrenheit in the sun to minus 280 in the shade, as well as ultraviolet radiation and micrometeorites moving up to 10 miles per second. Cosmic armor birthed by a bra company.
Today we launched Perseverance rover, and there were pieces of material for spacesuit design going to Mars, because again, we have to reinvent that protection, that suit, system. And because of the harshness of the radiation and what they'll just encounter on Mars. And it makes me think about, again, how we do space. Here was a company that had to say, look, give us a shot. You know, what can we do here? And I think about the psychology of how being on high seas and wanting, some of us really wanted a good spacesuit because we felt it was so important for the psychology of feeling like we were there. But I know that we struggled a little bit with like getting into that theme of being on Mars because our spacesuits weren't necessarily the best.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they were cumbersome. And for me in particular, I felt like I was always just concerned about like twisting an ankle because those rocks behind you, they're super shifty. And, you know, is actually kind of dangerous to go outside. And I've noticed some odd comparisons. I mean, between the quarantine and isolation that we've been experiencing, you know, to varying degrees during this pandemic with the Mars mission. I mean, of course, the major differences are that we knew that this was going to be over in 4 months, the Mars mission, and here this is sort of interminable. We really don't know when it's going to change. Also, the level of danger is very different from, you know, compared to the danger that we experience on Mars. But something that's kind of similar is thinking about having to like suit up and be prepared. You know, do I wear a mask, hat? You know, like, do I have my hand sanitizer in my pocket? You know, early days I was wearing gloves because I just thought probably I should, but it felt like it's just so many things you have to think about just to go out the door. And that's exactly what our experience was putting these suits on. It took forever, except you got very good at solo dressing, you know, because of the Velcro in the back. You figured it out because you were going out for your night photography projects. And, you know, it was, most of the EVAs, you know, the excursions that we did were like group affairs and someone had to stay back and like be on the walkie-talkie to make sure everything was okay. But you stayed close to the hab and you did a lot of night photography shoots and you just did that on your own. So you showed it was possible, but yet like even toward the end of the mission, we were still like, it took us, I don't know, 10, 15 minutes for everyone to suit up. And then we had the airlock for like simulating what an airlock experience was, even though it was just 5 minutes, but still just this sort of time to think about the fact that when you exit, you're going to be walking onto Mars. You know, it wasn't the easiest for me to imagine, I have to admit. Like I was kind of always aware of the fact that this was still Earth, you know, and I was always thinking, okay, don't break an ankle on Earth, but I don't know what that was. But I did like to try to like get into that reverie on occasion, but going outside, that's not the thing that worked for me. It was more like just letting myself float into that reverie. I mean, I had one experience, it's in the book, of like our shakedown mission where it was a kind of unexpected experience of imagining that I was actually on Mars, but more than imagining, kind of like, you know, being on Mars. So I don't know. I wondered if I could recreate that during the 4 months in Hawaii, but that didn't happen. So, yeah.
You know, I had a moment where at the Mars Desert Research Station, for those of you listening, we did a 2-week shakedown mission there at MDRS, where I remember having the mirror and I looked at myself and saw myself in the helmet and stuff. And I felt very like, I had this awe moment of, oh, I feel like an astronaut because I could see myself reflected in that. But
Yeah.
there are 2 things in high seas. When I think about our 4 months there and going out on EVAs, 2 very special ones. One of them was Oleg's death march.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. He just had us walking.
On that.
And then we came up to the caves and it like one false move and you could like slide into those like deep pits, and he called it a death pit in his Russian accent, which was pretty great. Found another death pit. Yeah. I had forgotten about that. That's really good.
Oh, and so just traversing that terrain and the hazards in this cumbersome suit, like you're saying, that would fog up and you'd had to wear a sweatband and wipe your head across the front of it so you could see. But the other one was a really special moment between just you and I, because there's the meteor shower. And we went out in the middle of the night and climbed up the hill. and laid down and watched the meteorites.
Yeah. Oh, I remember that. That was very special. Do you remember actually hearing the one that came across?
Yes,
Like there was that was incredible. And I mean, and I looked up that phenomenon because it's not actually sound waves; it's electromagnetic, and that's why you can hear it at the same time that you see it. Yeah.
I didn't realize that. And, you know,
Yeah.
and so those were some of the things where, again, talking about connections and needing to have, you know, you're talking about those conversations, but those moments that really helped us be more cohesive and make bonds, lifelong bonds. Um, that was definitely one of them for me, is that memory.
Yeah. That was very special. I remember we were in those green suits and laying on the rocks. And I remember the rocks were so cold and like the heat from my body getting like leached out by the cold rocks. And I was like, okay, like I can only do this for so long. But yeah, that was great. It was really fun to join you on that because you had just so many great nighttime photography adventures. It was a very cool project you brought to that.
Well, it was interesting to think about how, you know, again, fighting boredom through new engagements and novelty. And so, and what helped was the fact that you had come on in with those writing contracts and you were like, hey, will you be my photographer for Discover magazine? And I'm like, well, Kate, what? And so
Yeah.
challenging myself to take on night photography and to do the Meals from Mars and all of those kinds of things. But what I want to talk about next is there's a couple of things that really resonated with me. And one of them was isolation and how it manifests in many forms. Because when I would go out on these night photography, I was I was by myself and I kept thinking, if something happened to me, I'm so isolated. Would my crew members even come and find me? And I thought it was interesting that when I said, hey, there's a meteorite shower, who wants to come out? You were the only one. And so these feelings of isolation and the way you think about them is a big theme in the book. Can you explain a little more how isolation kind of resonated with you as a theme?
Yeah, I mean, um, well, when you asked about the meteor shower, that was toward the end of the mission, and I was getting kind of stir crazy, and I was just like, yes, anything. Like, let's do something new and fun and exciting. So yes, thank you for the invitation. This sounds really great. And I think that that's happening now with a lot of folks too. Like you're getting a little stir crazy, and I think that that's in particular when you need to start saying yes to things that you wouldn't have done otherwise, or you maybe don't feel like saying yes to. But what is it to just say yes and see what it is like, you know, trying something new, trying something different. So yeah, the themes of isolation, that essay kind of went all over the place, which is maybe appropriate for isolation because you're, you know, like kind of contained. And like, I don't know, for me there's a lot of space to move when you're contained and restrained like that.
Well, there was one part that I literally chuckled because thinking back, because we're talking about the end of the 4-month mission and, you know, trying to fight off some of the isolation by doing some novel things. But if you could read on page 111, the beginning of the chapter on isolation and us settling in to the high seas habitat.
Oh yeah. One. Sure. So, okay. It was the crew's first night. We had just arrived. We were settling in. Kim Binstead was preparing to leave for 4 months, nervous, I think, about launching this Mars mission, a project whose actualization was so uncertain throughout the buildup. NASA nearly pulled funding. There were delays in the construction of the habitat. That at times it almost seemed if any of us were to look down, we'd collectively run ourselves off the edge of a steep cliff. And yet here we were, in the shipping container. Attached to the dome, she and I stood, surrounded by 4 months of shelf-stable food, hand tools, and mountains of toilet paper and paper towels. In the shipping container, I followed her gaze to an axe leaning against the wall. And then I heard her say, maybe I should take this with me. I imagined what she might have imagined, or maybe it was just what I imagined, which was the very bloody deaths of our crew at the hands of one of us who might not be as mentally sound under the pressures of isolation, or even at the hands of an intruder because, though our habitat was remote, we were still technically accessible. In any case, the fact of my isolation and vulnerability, the realization of it, and my voluntary removal of myself from life as I had known it, sharpened. The axe. All work and no play. Does what to astronaut stand-ins? Vincent and I were quiet for a few seconds, and then, for unknown reasons, I insisted she not worry about it. We might need an axe if there were a fire, I said, or some other emergency. Also, if someone wanted to kill us, they could do so in many other ways, like pillow smothering, though I really did hope not to be murdered while pretending to live on Mars. She scowled and hesitated, then finally agreed to leave it. I still don't know why I was so confident the axe wouldn't be a problem. It wasn't, but I do wonder about my instincts in this case.
I, so many other ways, like smothering of a pillow. That to me, that's just really funny because, again, you were talking about bringing 6 relatively strangers together and saying, hey, live together in, this bubble for 6 months and 4 months and see how you get along.
Yeah.
And not knowing the personalities really, and not knowing where tipping points could potentially lie.
Right.
And so it's funny because it wasn't something that I had naturally thought of going into the habitat, but I was keenly aware of it coming out. And so thinking about the fact that you had this conversation with Kim going in, how do you even, like, you just say, it's all gonna work out?
Yeah, I don't know. So what I was thinking more generally is I kind of have this optimistic outlook. I had like great faith in our crew, but like you don't actually know what it's going to be like, what it's going to feel like for any of us at any point. So I just think that, yeah, I had a hard time imagining that it would end that way, even though I was imagining that it would end that way. And then I also thought that it might be useful. Like, why remove a tool if a tool could actually be useful? So I don't know if that was the best way to approach it, but in the end, it worked out okay, and I'm very happy for that.
Well, I'm all about survival anyways. And so I was always like, well, we might need to like hack our way out of the hab and all of these other things. But, every time I hear that or think it, Frank Lloyd Wright comes to mind because there was this incident with him. I don't know if you know this story, but his family was basically murdered by one of the caretakers, and Frank Lloyd House Wright was burned down, and they, and so I think about, and it was somebody who worked with, the staff. And that whole idea of like, well, who are we going to Mars with? And the part of it is to see the psychology and where breakdown happens, and tough conversations and all of those things with no training.
Right. So that was something that is just so different about our experience from what an actual Mars mission would be. Like we didn't have a ton of training there, but like an actual Mars mission, the crew would be working together for years and working very closely together for years. So that Mars mission for them, generally it takes like a little over 2 years to go to Mars, do a surface mission, and then come back. But you also want to count all the time that they're spending together in the years building up to it. Like that's intense. That's a very intense relationship and situation, but it would be a very exciting thing to have happen.
Before, and those of you listening, we are going to go to questions in just a minute. We've got a bunch of them coming in, but I want to really kind of take a moment to touch on one other theme that was really resonated with me again in the book, and that was the idea of inclusion and equity and diversity. But what was interesting is that you wrapped it all in to some extent with family, I feel like, because of your brother Mark, and his situation and what happened. And so how important was how therapeutic was this book in you kind of like dealing with a lot of the things around family and inclusion and diversity and equity and, you know, gender and LGBTQ and all of those things coming together?
Well, I mean, there's this essay called The Standard Astronaut that is, it's based on a piece I wrote for Slate that is based on an experience in the hab where I noticed that, you know, the women on the crew were eating essentially half as much as the men. And also our little armbands that were saying, you know, telling us how many calories we were using. Our caloric expenditure was like less than half of the guys. And it got me thinking, you know, if weight matters on a Mars mission, and it always matters when you're launching something into space. How might you reduce the weight of the payload? Well, if on a 2.5-year mission to Mars, if you could have the amount of food you send, that's a pretty significant weight savings, and that saves money. Or it allows for some other design of the mission. You could include some other things. So I wrote that essay for Slate, proposing an all-female mission to Mars and how it's just simply more economical. And so, but it really got me thinking about the issue of astronaut bodies and how we've come to accept or we've kind of come to accept a legacy idea of what an astronaut looks like. And I mean, an astronaut, if you look at the numbers, it is almost exclusively white men that have gone to space. And that's, I mean, there have been hundreds and hundreds of astronauts, and only a small fraction of them have been women or non-white men. And so, like, I don't know, I got to thinking about that question. And in particular, you know, my brother comes up in this book. He was born with spina bifida, and through the writing of this book, I sort of tell the story of his life and also his death, because he passed away in late 2016. And, you know, so this book includes that and includes me thinking about like who he was. And, you know, one time he asked if someone who was paraplegic, couldn't use their legs, could ever go to space. And, you know, I thought about it and I was like, I don't know, that, you know, we have this idea that astronauts are like strong and macho. But when I got to thinking about the astronaut body, really legs are kind of a liability. They're the thing that you have to exercise the most. They're like the heaviest amount of muscle, and so they really require a lot of tending to. Because you don't want to have like wasted muscles or wasted bone mass, and they kind of, in 0G, which is most of a Mars mission, they kind of like bang around and they're not used that much. So I thought, why not? I mean, there's so many soldiers who are coming back from wars who have amputated limbs. Why not like look at this from an engineering perspective, you know, switching out some sort of appendage, and then you don't have to worry about, first of all, the weight or the exercising of the legs. And so anyway, my brother and his spina bifida and his condition kind of got me thinking about the ways that bodies, we might want to think differently about bodies. But that just opens up the whole can of worms, because NASA is a very traditional organization. And, you know, you and I had that conversation about what it was like when you were an astronaut finalist in 2009, and your experience of just like looking around and saying, oh, wow, you know, your hair, you talked about your hair, and that, yes. And I love this haircut. And like, but you like, and it, oh, just how you walked into a room and you felt like, wow, I don't think I belong here, because, you know, your hair was kind of froed out that day, and like looking great, I have no doubt. But like to NASA, like that just is not what they're used to seeing. And like, what a shame that is, right? What a shame that there's been such a small sliver of humanity that's been allowed to have these experiences and bring them back and share them with the rest of us.
And if it's okay, I would like to read some of your words before we go to questions. And
Sure.
it's this is off of page 56. And because it just resonated with me. There are so many excellent people in this country, living now and throughout history, who have had their ambitions blunted before they could even get started, who have been told that they are not what America is looking for. What of the almost astronauts, or those who never even thought to give it a try? What might they have contributed to humanity's grand space endeavor? How might they have shaped it differently for everyone? And so thinking about that, especially when we're thinking about Mars and going to the moon and then on to Mars, and And when we're talking about space for everyone, it hasn't been. And so I feel like through things like this and bringing acknowledgement to that maybe we can make a change. I don't know if you were
Yeah.
thinking about that when you were writing those words, but yeah.
I like more conversations. I think conversations can lead to actions, and actions can truly change the world for all of us. So
Right, if those conversations are with diverse and inclusivity in mind, where, because again, who was making the decisions? And the people who are making decisions decide if it's going to be inclusive and diverse.
right.
And in the history-wise, it just hasn't been. So I'm going to open it up to questions now. And so Andy is asking, is it easy to take for granted how fortunate, lucky we are to live on Earth? What helps ground us too, about this planet when circumstances seem uncertain, even dire, whether it's a seemingly endless pandemic or going through a personal struggle? Very good question. Kate?
Yeah, it is so easy to take this place for granted. It's a prime location in the solar system and in this galaxy. It is just a really great planet, as we all know, but we tend to forget it. I don't know. And especially now in times, in these pandemic times, I think I try to read like history. I try to think about history, but like long time scales, like geological time scales, or like even reading about cosmology and just thinking about, and it's interesting that you use the word ground, but in a way I kind of like to like go bigger and understand, that time scales are pretty vast, and the human epoch is pretty short in the grand scheme of things, and the human life is pretty short too. So, and then if you home in on a day and an hour, it's not always easy. I don't always do it, obviously. It's a very tough thing, but I kind of like to do like an elastic time scale thing in my mind when I'm thinking about what is all of this.
You know, I feel like I'm really lucky because positivity is one of my top 5 strengths. And so I tend to be very positive and optimistic, but I'm also a geoscientist, and I know kind of like the dire challenges we have ahead of us, not only from the pandemic, but with climate change and all of these other things. And so sometimes I think, we always think of humans as the good guy or gal, the good person for humanity and the earth. But what if we're the bad? What if we're the evil one in this story of the earth?
Oh man.
And because nobody ever talks about that. And so how do we become or live up to the hero that we portray ourselves as being, but not just in the stories, but for the planet as a whole, in humanity, instead of being the Lex Luthors of the earth. And so I think conversations like this, and I know that I love technology, so I have faith, or I believe that we are smart enough and crafty enough and we'll figure this out. But will we do it in time? That's the question. Yeah. And so good question. And so I hope I didn't bum everybody out by saying we could be the villains in this story of the earth.
But I like the challenge of living up to the narrative of being the good guys, Right. And I say good guys, because I use the collective guys a lot from the Midwest. But I think that's a worthy challenge to pose.
Okay, the next question is from Christopher. What are your thoughts and feelings about the proposal that humans colonize other planets? I'll start with, I don't like the word colonize at all. I would say settle or, inhabit. But I think that it's a natural evolution for us as a species, because we you know, we currently have people living in space full time and bottom of the ocean, in the air. I mean, we are everywhere.
Yeah, I second that. I second that sentiment. Yeah.
It's really amazing how well we are able to adapt to environments we're not supposed to. And you hinted that about that, and you talk about that in the book about our bodies and our own ingenuity being overcome the limitations of our bodies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in a way, I kind of think of technology, the way that we conceive it, you know, the tools that we make to allow us to inhabit different spaces as like a natural extension of us, you know, us being humanity, a part of nature, and then our tools are also natural, you know. So like somehow, even though it seems like the most unnatural thing to have this body in space, because like our human ingenuity conceived of how to do it, it still is, it can be classified as natural.
Yes.
It's a
I feel the same way, because we're pulling the energy and the resources from our environment to manifest our reality and make these things happen. But it makes me, and I often, when I think about humanity outside of Earth, I really think it's this interesting combination of technology and hardware, software, and biology coming together in interesting ways for us to actually truly survive in space. So now we've got Kathy, who says, I read your book and really enjoyed many of your ideas. I worked at JPL, including real-time communications with a Mars orbiter. Have you thought about the difference between the 6 months to Mars in a smaller space and the subsequent time on Mars?
Oh yeah, so there are a number of proposals, right, to the time that is spent going there, and then like the time that you stay on the planet, and then time coming back. Yeah, I think that I don't know if that's going to be like either of those proposals is correct. I just think that it's best to think of design in terms of whatever's chosen, and like be aware that like either way it's going to be long and it's going to be hard. And like the communications, I'm so interested in that research, the real-time communication, and I don't know much about it, so I would love to learn more about that actually, because that's the part that's just so isolating and kind of like that could lead to despair over a long term, I think, you know, being so contained without comms back home. But yeah, I'm very interested in work.
I too, and I'm very interested. And I actually know people who are working on like AI with virtual reality, and how can we successfully kind of trick ourselves into having, you know, these conversations, these needed conversations, and making them feel like they're in real time, but you know, or making the whole idea of technology just being available. Because when I put on the VR glasses and I looked at, I don't know if you've done the VR from the International Space Station.
No.
And you can go out. There's one where it opens the doors and you go out and you just kind of look, and you're thinking, and you see the Earth. And I just sat there in awe, like, you know. But I think communications and technology, it's going to be interesting to see how we deal with that, because living in other sims, we did a lot of VR work and relaxation work, and just
that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, VR and AI stuff too. Like I am actually really interested in AI, and I think that again, it's like a design question. It doesn't have to be evil and scary. I think that it can actually solve a lot of problems if it's if the UI, if the user interface is designed with care and empathy, which isn't always the case with these things.
Right. Well, I know that you've done a lot of research in AI, and that's why I was curious as to your thought on where, you know, that could potentially go when it comes to solving one of the things they talk about is the ultimate analog that you would do before sending someone to Mars is that you would send them to the ISS, have them live there for 7 months, then come down and immediately go into a habitat like the high seas, live for, you know, a year, and then shoot them back up to the ISS for the journey back, and bring in that kind of simulation for another 7 months, and then have them return, and before ever even sending them to Mars.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. That sounds expensive. Yeah, but also like probably a wealth of data.
Robert, the person who runs NDRS, he's the one who proposed that would be, you know, he's like, yeah, you know, send them up, come live at NDRS, and then send them back and simulate it.
Yeah.
Okay, I know we're running out of time, so let me see another question here. For both, what were your favorite moments shared with your crew on the mission? Any specific memorable moments?
There were so many just like moments that pop up and like that actually even aren't in the book, you know. Not obviously everything is in the book, but as soon as, you know, I heard this question, just like a bunch of like ridiculous things, there was a lot of laughter. I remember laughing at a lot of things. There was one moment when one of the crew was like trying to lift the trash bag. I mean, just like domestic stuff. He was trying to lift the trash bag out of the trash can, and it spilled everywhere, and it looked like a commercial for something that would like solve the problem of spilling trash bags. And, you know, and he was so frustrated with it, and I just thought that, like, wouldn't that be funny to have like what those commercials would look like on Mars? So that's not a great example, but it's just like a funny thing that popped up, and then we laughed about it, you know. It's really good to have a sense of humor in these situations, and be able to laugh at yourself.
I think for me, the milestone parties that we had, the celebration, those going out on, again, we talked about the Oleg's Death March and us watching the meteorites, trying to find the ISS as it goes over. That was one of my things. But cooking, I love cooking with each of the crew members for Mars.
Yeah, the cooking was fun, and it was really fun to eat the delicious food that you in particular made. You were very talented at that. I think that we were a lucky crew to have you and Jahida in particular, because you guys really took that part of the mission seriously, and it was pretty wonderful.
It was interesting to see how food and the interaction at the dinner table really kind of set the mood. And I love in the book how you talk about, you know, the table and table choices and power designed because of the table choices. And really thinking about, well, maybe it should be a round table.
Maybe it should be.
You know, and not in a rectangle.
Yeah, if there's a hierarchy automatically imposed in the geometry of the table where you like interact every day for every meal, yeah, you might want to think about table decisions. And people did, you know, in the 70s on Skylab, that table was an equilateral triangle shape, purposefully to kind of minimize the idea of like hierarchy. So it's been done before.
Our hour is up. I want to thank everybody who tuned in and the questions and everything. And Kate, this book is just a masterpiece. I loved it, and I hope everybody listening will go out and get it because it's fantastic.
Thank you so much, Sian, and thanks everyone who showed up and asked questions. It was really fun. Sian, it was just so great. Thank you.
And thank you everyone for joining us at Powell's for tonight's event. It was a pleasure to host Kate Greene and Dr. Sian Proctor. Please consider purchasing a copy of Kate's book, Once Upon a Time, I Lived on Mars, by visiting powells.com. And while there, please be sure to check out our lineup of other upcoming virtual events. We look forward to seeing you at another one of our events soon. Kate, Sian, thanks again. It was a pleasure having you. We're really grateful.
Thank you.
Good night.